Sometimes history doesn't whisper. It bleeds through the cracks of time, leaving behind stories that were never meant to be found. Deep inside the American wilderness lies one such story, a chapter carved not with ink, but with fear, disappearance, and something far older than the men who walked into those trees. Most tales from the 1800s are documented, studied, and preserved, but some were buried on purpose. And when you hear what happened in the winter of 1875, you'll understand why the locals swore never to speak of that place again. The mysterious disappearance of the 112 loggers begins long before the men even stepped into the shadows of that forest, because the land they marched into was already carrying a history soaked in warning signs that no one bothered to read. These men were not inexperienced wanderers. They were seasoned workers who had survived storms, collapsing trees, wild animal attacks, and months of isolation in hostile terrain. They were used to the wilderness testing their strength. But the forest of 1875 was different in a way that none of them could articulate. When they first arrived, the silence was unnaturally thick, as if the deeper they went, the heavier the air became. Some of them joked that the trees looked older than time itself. Others kept glancing over their shoulders, sensing movement that never showed itself. They dismissed these feelings, as strong men often do, pushing them aside like the creeping cold at dawn. Yet the unease grew with every mile, settling into their bones in a way no winter chill ever had. On the first night inside the woods, several men reported hearing snapping branches beyond the ring of firelight. A few claimed they saw shapes shifting between the tree trunks, tall and thin, vanishing the moment anyone tried to shine a lantern toward them. The crew leaders told them it was nerves, or deer, or the forest adjusting to newcomers. But the older loggers, the men who had worked camps since their youth, whispered to each other that animals always make noise, always react, always reveal themselves eventually. These shadows didn't behave like any living thing they had ever seen. Still, they were bound to their contract and determined to complete the job. The company paid well, the stakes were high, and the men convinced themselves that fear was simply part of entering unfamiliar land. As days passed, the forest began consuming their sense of direction. Paths they marked with bright cloth disappeared overnight. Trees they cut down were found standing again in the morning, as if they had never been touched by an axe. Some men woke up disoriented, swearing they heard footsteps circling their tents. Others found their tools rearranged, placed neatly in patterns they didn't recognize, as though someone or something had been studying them. A few of the loggers tried to laugh it off, saying the younger workers were playing tricks, but no one ever confessed to the pranks, and their faces showed no hint of mischief. Instead, they looked as restless as everyone else, their eyes hollowed by sleepless nights and growing dread. The first disappearance happened quietly. A worker named Elias, known for his strength and loud voice, simply never returned from collecting water. When his friends went searching for him, they found only his footprints leading toward the creek, and none coming back. No signs of struggle, no torn clothing, no blood. It was as if the forest had opened its floor and swallowed him whole. By the next morning, 2 more men vanished during routine tasks. Panic crept through the camp despite attempts to keep order. The crew leaders tried to convince the group that the men had wandered too far and become lost, but the workers knew how to track, how to navigate, how to survive. They knew the land wasn't behaving naturally, and whispers began circulating about a presence watching them, choosing them, pulling them into the deeper layers of the woods. Within a week, more than a dozen men were gone. Some vanished in daylight, others during night watch. One man was found kneeling at the edge of the camp, staring blankly at the trees, his mind seemingly wiped clean. He couldn't speak or recognize the people he'd worked alongside for years. His heartbeat was slow and strange, as if he had been drained of something vital. When the men tried to move him inside a tent, he collapsed, and his skin felt unnaturally cold, despite the heat of the fire burning only a few feet away. They buried him out of necessity, but even while digging the grave, several workers swore the forest was listening. Terror spread like poison. The men attempted to leave, only to find that every direction looped them back to the clearing no matter how far they walked. Trails transformed behind them. Landmarks shifted. The forest felt alive, and worse, it felt purposeful, as though it had a will, and they had trespassed on something sacred or claimed. Food supplies grew scarce, and even the animals avoided the area. Birds that usually filled the morning air with sound were nowhere to be found. Nights were filled with distant wails that didn't resemble wolves or owls or anything familiar to their ears. At times, the trees themselves seemed to breathe, swaying even when there was no wind, their branches creaking with tones that resembled whispers. The few surviving men began turning on each other, driven mad by sleeplessness and the growing certainty that they were being hunted. Some spoke of long fingers curling around tree trunks, observing them from behind bark so dark it swallowed light. Others claimed to see faces etched into the wood, shifting their expressions when no one was looking. Hunger, fear, and hallucination blurred lines, yet the disappearances remained real. The crew shrank with disturbing speed, and every attempt to escape resulted in deeper confusion. The forest was reshaping itself, twisting reality, sealing them inside some ancient boundary they could not understand. By the time only 9 survived, their minds were fractured, their bodies worn, their memories shattered into disjointed fragments of screams, shadows, and cold earth beneath their hands as they crawled toward the last faint hope of daylight, not knowing if they were truly escaping or simply being allowed to leave for a reason they could not comprehend. The strange structures, carved symbols, and unexplainable remnants discovered in the abandoned logging camp decades later began surfacing only after a group of surveyors stumbled upon the overgrown clearing where the camp once stood. Time had not erased the place. Instead, it seemed to have preserved it in a state of eerie stillness, as though the forest itself had wrapped around the remnants like a cocoon. The men who discovered the site described an unsettling atmosphere before they even reached the center of the clearing. The trees surrounding it formed a ring, unnaturally symmetrical, as if planted with intention rather than grown by chance. Their trunks were thicker than those in the surrounding forest, their bark scarred with deep grooves that didn't match axe marks or any known natural phenomenon. The deeper the surveyors entered, the heavier the air became, and even the most experienced among them felt watched, as if something ancient was observing with silent patience. When they finally reached what remained of the camp, they realized it didn't resemble any ordinary abandoned site. Tools were scattered on the ground, rusted but arranged in patterns that made no sense. Lanterns sat upright in a perfect circle, their glass dusty yet unbroken. Shovels were stuck into the ground in straight rows, all leaning at the exact same angle, as though placed with deliberate care. The structures that remained were not buildings in any recognizable form. Instead, they appeared warped, bent inward, or twisted unnaturally, as if the forest had exerted pressure on them from all sides. One cabin's wooden beams were curled like the petals of a dying flower, yet the wood showed no signs of rot or burn. It was as though the shape had been forced upon it by some unseen power rather than time or decay. Stranger still were the carvings. They began appearing on the trees closest to the center of the camp. At first glance, they resembled primitive markings, but on closer inspection, they followed patterns too precise to be random. Lines spiraled inward, intersecting at sharp angles, forming symbols that didn't match any known writing system. Some resembled elongated figures with disproportionate limbs, stretching upward as though reaching for something above. Others were shapes so foreign and complex that the surveyors couldn't tell whether they were meant to represent language, maps, warnings, or something entirely different. What unsettled them most was the depth of the engravings. The cuts were impossibly smooth, as if something had carved through solid wood with the ease of slicing through paper. The deeper they explored, the more unnatural the remnants became. They discovered a series of wooden stakes in a perfect spiral around a giant tree stump at the far edge of the clearing. Each stake was adorned with carved notches that matched the patterns found inside the camp. The stump itself appeared burned at the center, yet none of the surrounding trees showed signs of fire, and the burn marks formed a ring that glowed faintly, even under layers of moss and dirt, as though the heat that once scorched it had not fully faded after decades. The oddity of it all made the surveyors question whether the stump had been used for rituals, executions, or something far stranger. They debated whether the loggers themselves could have created such arrangements, but the precision and complexity seemed too intentional, too coordinated, and too alien to match the panicked, chaotic conditions the survivors had described. As they moved toward the northern edge of the clearing, they found remnants of what appeared to be a makeshift barricade made from stacked logs. The barrier spiraled inward instead of outward, like a desperate attempt to trap something inside rather than keep something out. The logs were not nailed or tied together. They were fused. The wood merged at the edges as though melted, yet no scorch marks or residue indicated heat. It was as if the fibers had grown into one another in a single night, creating a solid mass that defied both logic and nature. When they attempted to separate two of the pieces, the wood resisted with a tension that felt almost alive, as though the structure itself didn't want to be disturbed. The soil around the camp was equally strange. Uneven mounds appeared in places where the ground should have been flat. When one man dug into one of these mounds, he found fragments of clothing buried several inches deep, but no bones, no personal belongings, no signs of the men who once wore them. The fabric was preserved unnaturally well, not rotted despite decades underground. It was as if the earth had swallowed only the bodies and refused the rest, leaving scraps as silent markers of whatever horror had taken place. Near another mound, they uncovered a set of stones arranged in an almost perfect circle, each stone etched with faint symbols. The stones were warm to the touch despite the winter air, as if they held heat trapped for years. The more they uncovered, the more the camp resembled a place where reality had bent, where time had fractured, and where the boundary between the natural and the unnatural had collapsed. Nothing aligned with ordinary explanations. The surveyors left with a sense that they had walked into a story that was never meant to be told, a remnant of something powerful, ancient and patient, something that had altered the camp and everything within it long before they arrived. The site was eventually reported, studied, mapped, and documented. Yet even experts from various fields could not agree on what the symbols meant, how the wood was shaped, or what forces could have created such impossible structures, leaving only theories, speculation, and a chilling sense that the forest still held the answers, guarded in silence and waiting for whoever dared to uncover the next piece of its forgotten nightmare. The eerie behavior of the 9 surviving workers, whose fragmented testimonies suggested something far more sinister than accidents or wildlife, became the dark centerpiece of the entire mystery surrounding the logging camp. When these men finally emerged from the forest weeks after they were presumed dead, they didn't look like survivors. They looked like ghosts wearing the skin of the men they once were. Their clothes were torn, not as though caught on branches, but as if something had clawed at them with deliberate precision. Their eyes were sunken, reflecting a kind of fear no human should ever carry, a fear that seemed to live inside them, rather than merely linger on the surface. They moved with a strange stiffness, as if their joints had forgotten how to function, and they spoke in low, trembling murmurs, their voices hollow and disjointed, as though pieces of themselves were still trapped somewhere in the forest behind them. Doctors who examined the men noted that their bodies, although exhausted, showed no severe injuries or signs of being lost for weeks without adequate food or water. Instead, the more disturbing changes were psychological. Several men refused to speak entirely, staring into corners as though expecting something to emerge from the shadows. One man kept his hands pressed tightly against his ears, insisting that he could still hear whispering, a whispering that grew louder whenever the room became silent. Another survivor was found rocking back and forth in his sleep, muttering in a voice that was not his own, a voice deeper and more strained, repeating the same unintelligible phrase until he woke up screaming. Their testimonies, when they could manage to speak, were fractured and conflicting, yet all shared common elements that made investigators uneasy. They described nights where the forest itself seemed to shift around them, trees moving without wind, paths rearranging and shadows stretching too far, stretching in ways shadows should never stretch. Some claimed they heard their missing co-workers calling out to them, but the voices didn't sound entirely human. They said the voices echoed unnaturally, coming from multiple directions at once, as if the forest was trying to lure them deeper in by borrowing the sound of familiar people. One survivor insisted that he saw Elias, the first man who had vanished, standing between the trees with an expression that didn't belong to him, with eyes too dark and too still, watching the living men silently without approaching. The more questions the survivors were asked, the stranger their behavior became. Sometimes they would speak in perfect clarity, recounting details so vivid that the listeners felt transported into the nightmare themselves. Other times they would stop mid-sentence, their faces draining of color, staring past the interviewer as though seeing something that no one else could perceive. One man described a night where the moon vanished behind a thick cloud that was not a cloud, but a shape, a towering figure of darkness that moved between the treetops. Another spoke of waking up to find strange markings carved into the ground around his sleeping spot, markings identical to those later found by surveyors, symbols that seemed to pulse faintly in the moonlight as if alive. When asked who made them, he responded that the forest made them, that the forest had hands, and those hands were everywhere. Investigators tried to piece together a timeline of events, but the survivors' stories were riddled with gaps, as if days or entire memories had been wiped clean. They remembered fear, screams, and running, but not always what they were running from. They described sensations rather than events, the overwhelming feeling of being watched, the heavy pressure of dread that pressed down on them at all hours, and the sense that something was following them, not by foot, but through the trees themselves. One man whispered that the forest learned their names, that it repeated them in the wind at night, stretching the syllables until they didn't sound like names anymore but warnings. Some of the survivors displayed peculiar physical symptoms that no doctor could explain. A few had deep scratches along their backs and arms, but the wounds were too evenly spaced, too symmetrical, as though carved with purpose. One man had a jagged mark across his chest resembling a twisted spiral similar to the carvings found at the site. Another survivor's hair had turned completely white within days of emerging from the forest, and he suffered violent tremors whenever asked about the last week inside the camp. Several men experienced hallucinations, reporting glimpses of tall, thin figures at the edge of their vision, figures that vanished when looked at directly. Even months later, some insisted they could still hear footsteps behind them when walking alone, heavy, deliberate footsteps that always stopped the moment they turned around. Authorities tried to classify the men's accounts as mass hysteria, trauma-induced delusion, or the effects of isolation, but the survivors reacted violently to such dismissals. They would panic, shouting that no one understood, that it wasn't hallucination, that something real had stalked them, something older than any story, something that lived beneath the forest and rose only when disturbed. They begged listeners not to return to the site, pleading with an urgency that bordered on desperation. The most unsettling testimonies came from the two survivors who had initially refused to speak. When one of them finally broke his silence, he claimed that the forest didn't just kill the others, it changed them. He described hearing his friends scream in ways no human throat should produce and seeing shapes that looked human but moved wrong, bending in unnatural angles. His final, coherent statement before descending back into terrified muttering was that the 9 were not allowed to leave. They were released and he didn't know why, but he feared the reason would one day reveal itself. The historical documents and missing records that hinted at a cover-up by the logging company and local authorities formed one of the most troubling layers of the entire mystery, because the disappearance of the 112 men did not fade naturally into obscurity. It was pushed, buried, and smothered under a deliberate silence that only grew more suspicious as researchers began piecing together the fragments left behind. When investigators attempted to trace the paper trail from the year 1875, they were stunned to discover that entire sections of company logs, financial books, employee rosters, and correspondence had vanished without explanation. It was not the kind of sloppy absence caused by time or carelessness. It was precise, targeted, and purposeful, as if someone had combed through the archives with a clear intention to erase every clue that could reveal what truly happened inside that forest. The logging company's leadership claimed the disappearance of documents was the result of a fire that destroyed part of their storage facility decades earlier. But eyewitness accounts told a different story. Several former employees who worked in the company's archive years after the 1875 incident recalled being ordered to remove specific boxes, burn certain letters, and lock away entire ledgers in restricted rooms that even mid-level officials couldn't access. When pressed for details, these employees grew nervous and evasive, insisting that they were only following orders and that they had been warned not to ask questions. One retired clerk confessed that his supervisor threatened to fire anyone who spoke about the logging camp incident or attempted to retrieve the missing files. The fear in his voice as he recounted this decades later suggested that the warning had carried far more weight than a simple order from management. Local government records were equally troubling. Town meeting notes from the winter of 1875 were missing multiple pages. Newspaper archives from that period contained only brief mentions of the logging expedition, with no follow-up reports, no interviews, and no public statements from officials. It was as though the town collectively agreed to pretend the event had never occurred. Even more unsettling were the gaps in the county coroner's books. The 9 surviving men were examined after their return, yet there were no medical reports, no written testimonies, and no official documentation of their mental or physical condition. It was as if their existence had been witnessed but never recorded, leaving nothing but oral stories and vague rumors in their place. Historians attempting to reconstruct the events found themselves hitting wall after wall, the missing pieces forming a silence louder than any written confession. Several researchers who digged deeper found inconsistencies in payroll documents from that year. The company paid out wages for only 60 men in the months following the disaster, though 121 workers had been employed at the start of the season. The remaining names had been scratched out, replaced with new hires who supposedly joined the company shortly after the incident. But these new hires had no known hometowns, previous occupations, or records of their existence anywhere else. Their identities appeared manufactured, as if someone had fabricated names to mask the disappearance of the original crew. The more historians analyzed the ledgers, the clearer it became that the accounting did not reflect an accident or natural disaster. It reflected an attempt to erase individuals from history altogether. A letter discovered by a private collector decades later added even more suspicion. Written by a company foreman whose name had been erased from official records, the letter hinted at a meeting between the logging company and local authorities days after the survivors returned. The foreman wrote that the men were not to be questioned further, and that the matter must be sealed for the sake of the town's future. He mentioned unexplainable circumstances and forces beyond our ability to control, wording too vague to be dismissed as superstition, yet too desperate to be ignored. The letter was unsigned and undated, but the paper, ink, and handwriting matched other documents from that period. Curiously, after this letter surfaced, attempts to trace the foreman's lineage or locate his descendants failed entirely. It was as if the man had been erased not only from the company's records, but from the town's entire memory. Even church records, the most meticulous and consistent archives in small communities, showed signs of tampering. Baptism logs, marriage registries, and death records from the mid-1870s contained sudden gaps. Names of families related to the missing loggers were removed or altered. Notes written in the margins by the town's pastor referenced unnatural fears, warnings given to the council, and events that must never happen again. But the pages following those cryptic notes had been torn out, leaving no explanation for what the pastor had feared so deeply. Historians attempted to interview the descendants of the pastor, only to find that they refused to speak about the matter, claiming their ancestor had been troubled by something he carried to the grave with him. Modern attempts to retrieve state records were met with bureaucratic obstacles. Some documents were labeled restricted, others had been misplaced. A few were technically available but heavily redacted to the point of being useless. Every line that could provide clarity was blacked out, leaving behind only fragments of sentences that hinted at quarantined land, restricted access, and unnamed dangers associated with the area. Researchers noticed a pattern. The deeper the inquiry, the more resistance they faced, as though invisible hands were still guarding the truth more than a century later. The cover-up became even more apparent when maps from the late 19th century were compared. Early maps showed the forest clearly labeled with boundaries and landmarks, but maps published after 1875 depicted the area as blank space or marked it simply as hazardous terrain. Some maps even removed the forest entirely, replacing it with vague shading and disclaimers advising travelers to avoid the region. This kind of alteration was unheard of at the time, especially for land that had once been a valuable logging resource. The choice to abandon it without explanation raised more questions than answers, fueling theories that the authorities not only knew what happened, but feared that whatever happened might return if disturbed again. The connection between the forest's unexplained phenomena and the long-buried indigenous legends that spoke of an ancient presence watching over the land became one of the most chilling revelations uncovered by researchers decades after the disappearance of the 112 loggers. Long before the logging company arrived, the forest had been considered forbidden territory by the native communities who lived in the surrounding region. They spoke of the land not as a resource, but as a living entity with memory, will, and boundaries that must never be crossed. Elders of the tribe rarely spoke of the place directly, but when they did, their voices dropped, their expressions tightened, and their eyes shifted as though recalling something too old and too powerful to be described in ordinary language. The forest had a name in their ancestral tongue, a name that roughly translated to the place where the earth listens. That name alone hinted at a presence far older than the settlement, the logging company, or the men who vanished in 1875. Oral stories, once dismissed as superstition, began to reveal unsettling parallels with the accounts provided by the 9 surviving workers. One legend described a time when ancestors entered the forest without permission, drawn by the abundance of ancient timber. The story said the trees themselves whispered warnings, and shapes moved among them that were neither animal nor spirit, but something in between, something that existed before language and before the arrival of humans. According to the legend, those who ignored the warnings were claimed by the forest, not in death but in transformation. Their bodies became shadows, stretched and distorted, their minds dissolved into the earth, their voices carried endlessly through the branches. This tale had been told for generations, not as entertainment, but as a memory of something witnessed, something feared, and something respected. Researchers who studied these legends noticed recurring descriptions of symbols carved into trees, symbols that matched the markings discovered centuries later at the abandoned logging camp. The carvings were said to be boundary signs, messages to outsiders that the land beyond them was not meant for human disturbance. The symbols were not written by the tribe. They were said to have been made by the presence that guarded the forest, a presence older than any tribe, older than any civilization, rooted deep beneath the soil. The indigenous stories spoke of it as a watcher, a guardian not of people but of balance, punishing those who took without permission or attempted to reshape the land according to their will. This ancient entity was described as neither benevolent nor malicious, simply a force that reacted when provoked, a force that protected the forest with an intelligence that did not think as humans think but behaved with purpose all the same. As historians pieced together these stories, they realized that the logging company had likely been warned. There were accounts from traders and scouts who interacted with the tribe years before the 1875 expedition, men who had been told directly to avoid that specific region of the woods. Some of these warnings were recorded in old journals and letters, though often written in dismissive tones, as if the writers were amused by what they believed to be superstition. They wrote about elders refusing to guide them through the forest, refusing to provide shelter to anyone attempting to enter it, and insisting that those who ignored the boundaries would not return the same. These warnings, ignored by the company, were buried under the promise of profit and the hunger for timber that seemed limitless at the time. The men who entered the forest walked willingly into a place generations had respected and avoided for reasons they did not understand. The most disturbing overlap between the indigenous legends and the survivors' accounts lay in the descriptions of voices. According to the tribe's oldest stories, the forest could speak, but not in language. It communicated through sound carried by the wind, through the rustling of leaves that did not match the weather, through whispers that mimicked human tones but did not belong to human mouths. The survivors of the logging camp described hearing their names whispered, hearing missing co-workers calling out to them in voices that echoed unnaturally from multiple directions, voices that drew them deeper into the woods. The legends warned that the presence used familiar sounds to lure intruders away from the safety of the boundary, isolating them one by one until they were surrounded, overwhelmed, and ultimately taken. Other parts of the legend described the forest shifting, rearranging itself in response to trespass. Paths that led somewhere one day would lead somewhere different the next. Landmarks appeared and disappeared, and travelers often described the sensation of walking in circles even when moving in a straight line. This mirrored the survivors' testimonies that every attempt to escape the woods led them back to the same clearing, the same camp, the same haunting presence watching from between the trees. The tribe spoke of this shifting not as an illusion but as the forest physically manipulating its layout, closing itself around those it intended to keep. The idea that the land could bend space, distort distance, and trap individuals inside a living labyrinth aligned too perfectly with the behavior described by the last remaining loggers for it to be coincidence. Even more chilling were the lesser-known tales that mentioned transformation. These stories warned that those who were claimed by the forest did not simply die, they became part of it. Their bodies dissolved into the soil or stretched into the shadows, their spirits absorbed by the presence watching from deep beneath the roots. Their consciousnesses faded, replaced by something ancient and hollow. Survivors of earlier encounters were said to return altered, no longer themselves, carrying a piece of the forest within them. This matched the behavior of the 9 men who walked out in 1875, men who seemed drained of their humanity, moved with unnatural stiffness, and spoke in fragmented sentences as though trying to remember how language worked. Their eyes reflected a depth of terror that suggested they had seen something beyond comprehension, something the legends had tried to warn about long before any outsider stepped foot into that part of the wilderness. Anthropologists who studied the tribe's oral history concluded that the forest was not simply a place with strange occurrences, but a boundary between the natural world and something older, something that existed outside the rules of time and mortality. The disappearance of the loggers aligned with these ancient warnings, not as an isolated event but as a continuation of a cycle that had repeated for centuries, each time resurfacing only when outsiders ignored the boundaries set long before their arrival.